it creates a ground plane. So you can put this way up in the air, and it's not being affected by the ground. In fact, you want to be high enough above the ground or even wet ground so it radiates better. And you've created that image effect by making the ground with those radials coming out. It changes the impedance, so you do match it by changing the angle. And we discussed this, what is it, 50?
The drooping, I forget the angle, the drooping ones are
45.
the ones that get to 50 ohms. And the straight out ones are about, so what, 72 ohms?
I think it's 72 ohms. So you can actually change the characteristic impedance at the feed point by changing the radials. What I use in the field is, you can only, well, you'll notice there's two ends to this because there's two parts. One is a long wire antenna that I can toss, wrap around a rock, toss it into a tree. And the other side is a counterpoise, which is about a half wavelength, and the other is 3/4 of a wavelength. I do this on 20, 30, 40, and 80 meters. And what the counterpoise does is it gives me an artificial ground to work from. Some people do two counterpoises at two different bands, so they don't have to keep changing, one for 20, one for 40. I, with my Z-match in there, can tune out the reactance pretty easily. But the radials are short, stubby things, counterpoises are long, but what you're doing is you're creating a ground for your vertical antenna.
For HF vertical antennas, they're not so short, stubby things. Most of them are. You have the roof-mounted radials, where you can have a kit that you can buy mostly to mount for roof-mounted, or you can bury them or lay them out if you're just making temporary antenna. Lay them out on the ground. I buried my aluminum ones and the ground ate them right up. So don't use aluminum in this soil around here.
My mentor has 160 meter half wave vertical, and under that he put 120 radials in the ground, which is considered the optimum number of radials. And at about 40 radials, he noticed he was getting out much better. By the time he got to 80 radials, he noticed a large effect. It was lowering the impedance of the antenna. Every time he had to retune the antenna every time he added more radials. When he put in the last 40, all of a sudden he noticed it was a 6 or 8 dB gain from when he started with the first 20 radials. But it takes a while for you to cut all those slots and lay in all that wire. And each one of those wires was half a wavelength long. So it was a lot of trips to Lowe's to get THHN, whatever. What does that mean?
Thermoplastic heat resistant.
It's cheap wire that goes in the ground real nice, and it lasts much longer than your aluminum.
We had to switch to copper-clad steel wire out in Thailand because the local population stole the copper ones by digging up the ends and pulling on them until they broke.
Horizontal unbalanced antennas, such as a long wire or a random wire, which is what I'm using with that rig, need an RF ground that should be 10 to 15% longer than the antenna wire. This is called counterpoise. This wire can be laid in any fashion except crossing over itself. So you can make S's or Z's just as long as it doesn't lay on top of itself. This wire has large RF voltages in it. While you're transmitting, I would advise people not to touch the end of the wire, or else you get to the bone burns. They are quite painful. So if your dog likes to go over there and sniff things, put a piece of tape around there, and you might get voltages up to 1,000 volts, even with QRP rigs, which is very low power. So you can burn up valence really
It's RF voltage, so it goes through skin pretty easily.
Yeah, right to the bone.
Yeah.
You learn quick.
It smells like burning flesh. I've done that every time.
It is.
Oh, let's see now. We talked about antennas and topography, but you do want to, if you're in a canyon, you might want to use bounce off a canyon wall to work someone opposite you. So if you have a Yagi, you might want to point it into the box canyon to work someone behind you. We did this in Albuquerque for that, what's the La Luz trail run. Because we couldn't hit the repeater at the top of the mountain. We were aiming into the canyon to hit the one in Rio Rancho, which then hit to the one on top of the mountain.
It's all kinds of stuff there. I mean, you can bounce it off everything.
And occasionally you get to use knife edge there too, which is a nice propagation mode. But you need sharp mountains, and they can't be really well foliated. You got to have mountainous terrain and not rocky. And it can be rounded, but what you're doing is it's actually diffracting, and you're bending it down. So you aim up at the edge of the cliff, and it will bend it down at a lower angle. So you'll get out much better, out of your canyon much better.
That same principle works with light, is how it was noticed. You see the interference, when you go knife edge, you see the interference line starting to get dark.
Well, if you've ever tried to shoot a fish, it's that same
Yeah.
Then we talked about tideland and marshy areas. The same problems. You need to be well above the wet soil. So if you can get your antenna up on a mast, or if you can, there's something called a Slim Jim, which is made out of 300 ohm thin lead. It's actually a J-pole like this, but it's made out of twin lead that you've cut and you fed. And it's very, very thin. You can use a wrist rocket, get a line up into a tree, almost, and put this way up in the air so you can get away from your wet soil, and you get out much better. And if you want to do some testing, you lower your antenna down to the wet soil, get closer and closer, and you'll find out all of a sudden the person at the other end goes away. Around here, we don't have to worry about that too much, except Vernonia flooding all the time. Get your antennas up. Near and far field interactions. Well, the wet, marshy soil and the type of ground is one near field interaction. It also causes far field problems because you lost signal strength. And Stan, your problem is a really bad near field interaction between a dipole antenna and a metal roof.
Yeah.
So it's basically like extremely good ground. The electric waves, electric field lines go right to that, and it probably suck out half to 3/4 of your RF goes right into heating up your roof.
Yeah.
So instead of a cloud burner, you have a roof warmer. Or worm burners. I've also heard that
The
too.
county gets paid electric bill for that.
You might want to think about halfway vertical or a sloper.
Yeah, we talked about that.
Can you just take your dipole and get it higher? Or is that really?
On 80 meters,
Oh, okay.
It's an 8160
Oh,
dipole.
never mind.
It's got to go way up.
Yeah, okay. No,
we
I
don't
wasn't
grow
sure.
trees that big, even in Oregon.
How about a reflector underneath the dipole that's used in some NIVIS antennas?
Yeah.
Insulated from the ground.
What I advocate is for him to, if it's insulated from the ground, if your roof is not tied to the ground electrically, but still I'd want to model that and start moving your dipole in relationship to the roof and see if you can get any lobes in the direction you want. But I'd go with modeling software for that.
Actually, the problem we had was we couldn't get the standing wave down.
Yeah.
It was the problem. We couldn't tune it.
Part of that problem is the roof is
Yes.
sucking it and changing the
Yeah.
characteristic
Yeah.
impedance. It's not good.
That might be worth running a modeling program there.
Yeah.
But I still would say get away from the dipole,
Yeah.
because you have to be half a wavelength away, and 80 meters half a wavelength is 40 meters, which is over 130 feet, 140 feet. Well, I just mentioned number 2. Strongly affected by water and metal in the near field. Okay, we already discussed that. Okay. Let's see. No.
That would be affected.
Yeah,
No.
That's the technical writer speaking.
No. Effect.
Antennas are strongly AFF, ECTV.
Affected by, yes, you're right.
The antennas
See, I need an editor. I did all this myself. Many hours
Not
a
to
day.
worry.
Okay.
I probably wouldn't have
This
caught
wouldn't
it.
even be grammar check.
again.
But it's not A. It's not an affect. That's when your teenage daughter gets this mood.
That's not an affection.
Okay. Here's your antenna modeling software. I have